She had been carrying that lecture like a wound for 20 years, an ache she could not admit even to herself until the night she walked into Dr. Riso's office and let the hurt spill out like water from a broken vase. Maya was 51, angular where she used to be soft, her hair threaded with silver and stubbornness, and she had learned, over decades of quiet compromises and loud silences, to believe that desire was something other people had. She had loved. She had been loved poorly. She had been betrayed and forgiven and betrayed again. She had kept the pieces together because that was what grown-ups did. They stitched, they mended, they made life continuous to the children, the mortgage, the calendar. Intimacy, she discovered in these late years, was the one thing she stitched badly. On the first day she met him, Dr. Walter Riso, she thought she had come for reassurance. He sat behind a modest desk, the room smelling faintly of lemon and aging books. His voice was steady, not the brittle cheerfulness of a seminar guru, but the soft certainty of someone who had watched hundreds of couples unravel and rewoven themselves. He wore no spectacles, but his eyes held a kind of focus that made it impossible to lie to him inwardly. He read her like music, like a patient tuning into a song that had once been familiar but had been forgotten. "Tell me the saddest thing you've heard in 30 years. Maya heard him ask at some point, not as an indictment but as an invitation. She told him everything and nothing. She told him about the nights of silence, the polite sex, the moments after where his side of the bed grew colder faster than she could explain. She told him how men left as if they had been merely checking out a room, how some came back and some never did. She told him about the shame of wondering whether she had ever been enough, whether something in her body, some measurable imperfection, had been the downfall. He listened. And when he spoke, he gave her neuroscience like a lantern. "You're not missing a trick," he said. "You are missing a conversation with yourself." From that day, his language threaded through her nights. Dopamine, vasopressin, oxytocin, sympathetic nervous system activation. He explained how the male brain was both simpler and more complicated than myth permitted, driven by novelty and intensity, yes, but also by the longing to be meaningful, to be chosen. He described, clinically and then tenderly, the subtle architecture of attachment that forms in the quiet minutes post-orgasm, the silence that can become a bridge or a chasm, depending on whether someone stays to hold it. Maya listened at first like a student. Then she listened like a woman cataloging tools she had never known she owned. When he spoke of presence, that single word became a liturgy. She felt it reverberate against the rib cage of an old life. Presence meant leaving the calendar at the bedroom door. Presence meant being in her senses, not in her worries. Presence meant moving her body with intention and listening to the breath of another person as though it were a language. Presence could be taught. It could be practiced like breathing. It was, he insisted, 80% attitude and 20% technique. He taught her to look at the act of intimacy as an economy of signals. Eye contact, for instance, was not merely romantic. It was neurological. Two people staring into one another's eyes during sex activates mirror neurons, those small translators in the brain that make empathy possible. When she held a gaze, she learned, she offered him a map to her interior world. When she turned away, she closed the map with a soft, undecidable seal. What are you afraid of when you look at him? Dr. Riso asked once, when she told him she could not sustain the hard honesty of the eyes. "Of being seen," she said, "of being small." He nodded. Being seen is a risk, but hiding guarantees a sameness that makes any lover indistinguishable from the last. He did not ask her to become anyone else. He asked her to be present to herself. "Before you worry about what he feels," he said, "worry about what you feel." He taught her to breathe into that feeling, to name it without judgment. He suggested practices so mundane they felt radical. Breathing slowly during foreplay, maintaining eye contact for a count of heartbeats, letting her hands describe the topography of his shoulders like learning a new map. Maya began to practice. Small at first, an attentive breath here, a single sentence of curiosity there, then more daring experiments followed. A whispered question in the dark, a deliberate slow movement that invited instead of received. She found that the bed did not become an arena of performance, but rather a laboratory where both could fail and still be kind about the failure. The story pivots not on one night of revelation, but on the accumulation of 1,000 little renunciations and acceptances. For Maya, the moment came in the half-light of a Sunday morning. Her partner then, Daniel, who had returned in his gentleness and fatigue, was clumsy with tenderness. He brought coffee, the cup steaming between his palms like an offering. He did not know the heuristics of post-sex connection the way she did now. He thought, as many men did, that the encounter ended with a physical finale. He stood at the edge of the bed, innocently poised to leave, when Maya reached out and took his wrist. The contact did not speak the language of hunger. It spoke gratitude. They lay back, held hands, listened to the small domestic sounds of the apartment. He sighed. It was not a release of performance anxiety. It was a softening that made them both feel easier in their skins. Something in his chest rearranged, like a book put back on the shelf, and in the quiet after, he murmured her name with a surprise that felt like devotion. It was not chemistry as in the movies. It was the slow chemical binding that Dr. Riso had explained. Vasopressin small, territorial promise to anchor to a familiar shelter. That morning melted into a week of experiments. She learned how to read him, how to notice the small signs of stress that meant cortisol was high and sexual appetite low. She learned to offer non-sexual intimacy as a salve, a shoulder massage at dusk, a hand press against his lower back when he stood at the sink. She learned to give him space without withdrawing herself, to be a companion and an island at once. One evening, after a long day that had frayed the edges of both of them, they found themselves at a neighbor's small rooftop party, an affair of string lights and cheap wine. Among the chatter, Maya's eyes caught on a woman who moved through the crowd like a comet. She was not younger. She was different in manner, animated, unself-conscious, luminous. Daniel watched her, and the sight broke something in Maya she had not known was brittle. Old stories, the ones about not being desired, quickened like old machines until she could feel the familiar small panic of comparison taking over. Instead of retreating into resentment, she walked toward Daniel, took his hand, and drew him aside. She did not ask him to stop noticing. She did not demand a confession. She asked, in a voice that did not tremble, whether he felt drawn, whether he was aroused at the sight. He blinked, then laughed, because his attraction was not an indictment. He admitted, honestly, that novelty captivated him. The brightness of newness, the promise of a different story. Maya listened and let the truth be a mirror rather than a dagger. In novelty there is nothing shameful. Dr. Riso had told her before. Our brains are built to respond to newness. The trick is to make your presence itself novel, to be a life that surprises. So she became a curator of surprises. Not deceitful tricks or manipulative games, but small, authentic variations. A note in his jacket pocket, a new way of making tea, a memory resurrected from an old trip that they could laugh about. She changed the textures of their nights, the time of day, the music, the places, so that their brains were given different paths to the same pleasure. Novelty, practiced with care, does not betray love. It sustains it. He taught her about the dark twin of desire, need. Need, he said, smelled like fear. It had the texture of a hand gripping for security. Desire was a choice. Need was a wound. Many women conflated the two, and in that confusion they offered the wrong energy, a pleading that dimmed attraction rather than enhancing it. Maya learned to cultivate abundance, a life threaded with books, friendships, a small vegetable patch on a balcony that she tended like an altar. She did not become cold. She became whole. She carried both the independence of a woman who could survive and the vulnerability of a woman who could thrive. The narrative of her transformation is rich in the ordinary. There are pages we could publish like instruction manuals. How to breathe, how to use lubricant without shame, how to do pelvic floor exercises without turning them into moral judgments. But the story's metal is softer than technique. It is about reconciling with the body. For years she had faulted her body for changes wrought by time. Drier skin, a looseness where once there had been tautness. She had worn dark pajamas to hide the silhouette, turned off lights like a thief. The therapy taught her a radical gratitude. The body has served you, it has loved, it has birthed and danced and stumbled. When she began to touch herself with that gratitude, to trace her scars like metals, something shifted in the way the room received her. Men do not see bodies as maps of flaw. They feel an energy. Confidence turns perceived imperfections into signifiers of meaning. One night, after an argument that bled into the hours with the sharpness of unspoken grievances, Daniel and she lay awake with the ceiling like an indifferent sky. She could have reacted in the old ways, plead, withdraw, but she had learned a different ritual, the practice of conscious forgiveness. She spoke, not to argue, but to name. "I felt lonely," she said. He, in turn, spoke of days when he had felt insufficient. They did not resolve everything, but they allowed themselves to close the account on small grievances by choosing to be gentle. Forgiveness was not forgetting. It was a choice to prioritize peace. Maya came to understand that sexual chemistry is not a firework, but a garden. It requires planting, watering, occasional pruning. It is not only spontaneous combustion. It is deliberate cultivation. She learned the art of foreplay beyond the bedroom. Notes, looks, messages that created mental arousal long before clothing came off. She learned to make mental foreplay part of the fabric of their days because men, like all humans, are primed by imagination. She became adept at planting seeds. A glance over coffee, a lingering touch during a grocery trip, a private joke that lived in the ribs. These small anticipations created a neural architecture in Daniel's brain that graded their encounters with the pleasure of expectation when they finally arrived at skin. There was a fierce honesty, too, the kind that terrifies because it requires a surrender of defenses. In the bedroom, she stopped faking. She refused a live performance. He told her once quietly, "I can tell when you're faking." There was no accusation in the tone, just a tenderness that made her want to be seen properly. She practiced being honest about what she liked, what she wanted, what she did not, and the admission did not exceed into neediness. It was clarity. Clarity felt like power, and power, she discovered, had nothing to do with dominance. It had to do with agency. Taking control, in the ways that pleased her, was not about aggression, but about leading her body into pleasure. It meant moving with a deliberate rhythm that said, "This is my delight. Take part, if you will." It had a liberating effect on him. He didn't have to be the sole navigator anymore. He could follow and be followed. Mutuality, they both found, made pleasure not a commodity to be measured, but a shared melody. The story deepens when she begins to encounter stumbling blocks she had not foreseen. The weight of old memories. The inertia of man's own scripts written by pornographic fantasy. Daniel, like many men of his generation, had images in his head shaped by screens that emphasized performance and the miraculous availability of novelty. She did not attempt to compete with fantasy. Rather, she offered authenticity. "You can give him real desire," Dr. Riso had told her, "more powerful than any edited image. What they crave under all the spectacle is to be chosen, to be seen as special." When she gave him that, her attention, her distinct pleasure, he began to prefer the real thing. The story is not triumphant in a way that pretends fixed perfection. There are nights when she fails to be present. There are days when resentment climbs into the conversation, like a hungry animal. There are jealousies and miscommunications. But the arc of the tale is one of learning how to interrupt patterns, not by hating them, but by understanding them enough to choose differently. She learned to repair with action, not words alone. She learned to show through the daily rituals that she had changed by being changed. Once, she read an article in a magazine at the hairdresser's, and there it was in black and white, an injunction that women of a certain age were invisible, that sexual worth had an expiry date. She folded that magazine like a letter she didn't intend to keep and walked home to plant basil in her balcony pots. She fed the plants with a devotion that had nothing to do with sexual validation. The basil thrived. The man she loved came home and inhaled the small garden with a childlike delight. "You smell like summer," he told her. That said everything. Maya's story spreads beyond the intimate. Her change radiates into friendships and her work. She no longer waited for validation in the small hours. She carried it with her. Men in her circle, friends she had known for decades, started to notice something that could not be named with hormones alone. "You glow," a co-worker said. Another, more blunt, asked if she had started dating someone new. She laughed. It was not a new man, but a new version of herself. one who held her losses like a map and carried regret like an ache that had been translated into action in the most intimate moment, the one that becomes a story's fulcrum. Maya stands in her bedroom at midnight and understands the power of the postcoital minutes. Daniel, spent and peaceful, rests his forehead on hers. She feels a halo of neurotransmitters, the oxytocin that tilts toward closeness, and the opportunity for vasopressin to anchor. Instead of asking for declarations or starting a fight about the future, she chooses to stay. She speaks softly a truth that is not a plea but a gift. "I like being with you like this." He whispers back something of the same tenor. "So do I." They remain in that small communion until morning folds into them. Walter Riso, Dr. Riso, had promised he would tell her truths without fairy tales. The truth was not always comfortable. It demanded relentless self-work, therapy when needed, the reconstruction of core beliefs that had once told her she was not enough, a deliberate intolerance for the shame that had attached to the changes in her body with time. He had said that mental health is both the soil and the sun of intimacy. A mind that tended itself produced a woman whose presence no longer begged. She became someone whom a man wanted not, because she was a mirror of his fantasies, but because she was a whole person who chose him. That choice, Dr. Riso insisted, was combustible. There's a scene where Maya sits across from another woman at a cafe, a woman in distress, whose voice trembles with fear that she will never be wanted again. Maya recognizes her. She remembers the night she took her own hand and did not let it go. She remembers learning how to speak to herself with a compassion that required a discipline of thought. She shares with the woman, without theatricality, the tools that had saved her: breathing exercises, daily gratitude, honest communication. She tells her not to mistake need for yearning. She tells her to plant basil. The story culminates in a small wedding, an informal promise between two people who have learned the hard art of being present. It is not an abandonment of solitude, but celebration of chosen companionship. The ceremony is modest. Friends, music, an old record playing in the background. It is not about sealing a fate. It is about acknowledging practice, of staying, of renewing, of being conscious. In his speech, Daniel says imperfectly and precisely, "I do not own you. I choose you every morning." She thinks of vasopressin and of territory, and she smiles because choosing is not owning. It is an act of reverence. The last part of her story is not a perfect closure, but an honest continuation. There are years of daily practices. There are missteps and recoveries. There are still boundaries and adjustments. The acceptance of the body's changes with the tenderness of someone who waters a plant after winter. She continues to go to therapy sometimes, not because she is broken, but because she is alive and is willing to tend her inner garden. The greatest lesson, perhaps, arrives in a quiet moment when she realizes she no longer fears the question, will he come back? Because she has ceased to center her life on the return of someone else. She has instead rearranged her days around self-possession. The men who come into her life before or after encounter a woman with a capacity for joy that is not contingent on them. This is not arrogance. It is resilience. It is the attractiveness of a person who has learned how to be a companion without being a beggar. People often ask, what is the secret? The secret is there is no secret, only practices. A life of intimacy requires a life lived with curiosity. Curiosity about the body, about the mind, about the small decisions that compose desire. It requires the courage to be seen and the will to keep being seen even when the mirror shows lines that were not there before. It requires a daily refusal to let shame govern the bedroom door. And in the end, what Walter Riso had promised her came true in a way that was neither grand nor theatrical. He had given her a language for what felt like a mysterious failing. He offered her not a guarantee but an ethic of presence, of courage, of renewal. The lesson was not that she could make any man remain, but that she could become the kind of woman whose presence made men want to stay because they could not imagine their mornings without her. She wrote one last note before bed, a small list of rules she had invented for herself, and pinned it beside her mirror. Breathe first. Choose yourself. Speak clearly. Be tender. Be honest. Cultivate novelty. Forgive with intention. Let the 5 postcoital minutes be a ritual. Plant basil. It read like a recipe and like an invocation. When Daniel read it the next morning, he laughed and kissed her temple. "You always smell like summer," he said. Maya closed the window and listened to the world, the muffled noise of a city that was always wanting, always offering new things to distract the heart. She felt, instead, a steady ember inside, a warmth that came from tending, from learning to be present, from the small indignity of refusing to believe herself invisible. She had not become a perfect lover or a perfect woman, only a woman who refused to remain a ghost in her own life. That is the story she lived and the story she told, not as a manual but as a testament. That intimacy is less a thing that happens to you than a thing you cultivate. That masculinity is not a simple set of instincts, but a complex architecture of vulnerability. And that desire, when fed with attention and honesty, becomes not a fleeting chemical high, but a long, patient architecture of care.